Hello and welcome to this Community Writing Center workshop. The Community Writing Center offers individual writing consultations and writing workshops for all writers in the Great Lakes Bay region free of charge. To learn more about our services, including virtual and face-to-face feedback on your writing, upcoming writing workshops, and our various writing contests and events, please visit our website at communitywritingcenter.com. This online workshop series was sponsored by funding from the Bay Area Community Foundation and the SVSU Center for Community Writing. Hi, I'm Kelly Fitzpatrick, a Michigan-based author and educator, and it is my pleasure to present to you the third session in our poetry writing series, which will focus on the skill of found poetry. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's get started. Welcome to our workshop on crafting poetry. The purpose of today's workshop is to demonstrate that a poem can come from anywhere, and we're going to do that by exploring the style of found poetry. This workshop is appropriate for both beginning and experienced writers, and it will last approximately 90 minutes. For materials, you'll need a notebook, a writing utensil, and some random texts and objects around you. You're welcome to use whatever is available. It's really pretty open-ended for this exercise, but you will be able to make use of some of those things that are near you. All of our workshops aim to create an inclusive, respectful, and productive environment for all writers. We aim to provide feedback, strategies, and resources writers need to improve their writing and to encourage collaboration between writers through active conversation and participation. Here's a preview of our workshop and what you can expect during our time together today. We'll open with a quick write and discussion to kind of just get our creativity going. Then we'll move on to a brief craft talk about found poetry style and process, followed by some mentor texts and guided practice. And then we'll get a prompt and some extended writing time, including guided revision. And today's is going to be multi-step and pretty comprehensive because that's the whole awesome draw of found poetry, is that you get to just keep adding in new interesting elements. And then we'll finish up with some analysis and sharing and talk about some takeaways for applying these learnings to your own writing. All right, let's start with our opening quick write to get our creative juices flowing. For this activity, I want you to take a moment to record and briefly describe the following in a page on your notebook. So you're going to grab the closest object to you. If you have lots of objects near you, you can choose the one that looks interesting. And now it doesn't necessarily have to be something you can pick up. If you're outside in a park, for example, you could choose a tree. Or if you're in an office, you might choose an object on your desk. It's really completely open-ended. But when you describe it, I want you to attempt to use some sensory detail, which we talked about in some of our earlier workshops, if you had a chance to join us for those. So use your five senses as you're describing maybe the tactile feel of this, the weight of it, the look of it, etc. Second thing I want you to record is one color that you are wearing, and use a simile to describe that color if you can. So one color that I am wearing is black, so I might say black like midnight, etc. One sound that you currently hear. And yes, silence is a sound. So if you are lucky enough to be in a very quiet place, you can definitely describe that, but I want you to use a metaphor. Remember, a simile is comparing two unlike things with like or as, and a metaphor does the same thing, but without like or as. And then finally, one emotion that you have recently felt. It could be one that you're feeling this moment, or just that stands out as prominent in your experience recently. So once you have all four of those things written down, which I'll give you time here in a second to do, then you're going to write a poem connecting these four elements in some way. Or you could just use them for inspiration and see where it leads you. So you don't necessarily have to put all four of them exactly as they are into the piece, but lay them next to each other and see what happens, what comes of that juxtaposition of these elements that maybe normally you wouldn't incorporate together into a creative work. See what happens when you attempt to do that. So I'm going to give you some work time here to both record those elements and then to go ahead and just see if you can get a short draft of some lines of poetry going here. And then we'll come back to this piece later in the workshop. You have about 30 seconds of writing time remaining. Okay, we're going to come back together here, and hopefully you had a chance to pen some lines of poetry that we can play with here. What I'm going to do is give you a preview of the discussion instructions, then we'll look at an example poem together and kind of tear it apart, and then I'll put these back up on the screen for you to apply them to your own quick write. So the directions read, now read your poem draft out loud, because it's important for us to hear poetry with our ears, then answer the following. What style did you use to connect the elements? So lyric, narrative are two of the styles that we looked at in our previous workshops together, but there are also many other styles. How did you kind of combine them as you were crafting your poem? Second, did anything unexpected or interesting emerge as you were writing and thinking? Is there an abstract idea or theme coming to the surface? So if you remember in our workshop on elements of poetry, we talked about abstractions as being universal themes that often show up in poetry. So do you see one of those peeking its face out in the draft that you have currently going? And then I always like to encourage writers to underline your favorite section or the part that is really speaking to you or that seems like it's striking the right chord, because we're going to be working a lot with revision today, and it's really important to not lose the parts that you love. So it's easy to kind of go back and start messing with stuff, and sometimes things can get jumbled around and disjointed. So you want to mark those spots that you're like, yes, I love this. This feels right, so that you can make sure to keep those pieces intact later on. Another strategy for that, if you're not already, I like to copy and paste my drafts either down below on the document or into a clean document when I'm about to revise them, so that I still have the original left in case I don't like the revision that happens to it. So before I set you loose to do this on your own piece, let's take a look together at an example response here that I wrote. So the set of prompts that I gathered, the object that was near to me was a mason jar full of written memories, so like just little moments that I wrote down and stuck in the jar. The color that I was wearing is black, and the sound I could hear was a whirring motor, very soft but there, and then the emotion I went with was some apprehension. So in order to tie these all together, here's the poem that I wrote. I'll read it out loud and then just quickly identify those elements of analysis that we're looking for here. The motor always whirs continuous to clean the air, but somewhere in the black there is a nothingness that spins on itself, cycling around to remembered flicks of a second hand in space cauterized by time, which is distance, which is numbness, waiting out the interval between breath and fear, the only jotted life that can't be capsuled in a mason jar to shelf sit eternal. Okay, so if you remember the questions here, what style did I use to connect the elements? This is definitely more of a lyric style. We don't have a plot going on here like we would with narrative. It's several different images that rely on a specific language to evoke a feeling or an emotion. And I would also say this is a kind of stream of consciousness, which we'll look at a little bit later in this workshop, as a style, but that involves allowing whatever images come to your mind to just flow out continuously onto the page. And so that's kind of what happened here as I started with one element, which was the sound, and then just slowly let it drift to something else and then tried to connect those with language that felt right. Did anything unexpected or interesting emerge here? I've never thought about time as being cauterized into chunks by our clock keeping system, but that was an idea that sort of surfaced here while I was thinking about these things, and that's interesting to me. I might come back to that later on. Is there an abstract idea or theme coming to the surface? There's potentially several that are emerging here. I would say one of them is definitely the idea of cycling or circling around something, because we literally have a motor spinning. There's the word continuous in here, the word cycling, and then this idea of being eternal. But then we also have this idea of something maybe being fleeting or impermanence, because there's certain things that there's nothingness. We've got the color black, so maybe playing with that sort of binary opposition there for a theme that's starting in this draft. And then my favorite section, I would have to go with, I really like the word capsuled as a verb. I've never used it that way before, so that's kind of interesting to me. So this is not necessarily a finished piece, but it's something to play with now as a draft that I can go off from. So I'm going to give you a few minutes here to go ahead and analyze your piece. You're welcome to mark it up if you would like to. We will be coming back to this to revise it one more time later in the session after we look at some skills. All right, time for our craft talk. This will be a mini lesson featuring some mentor texts, some concepts, and some guided practice. So for this concept that we're working with today of found poetry, it's a little bit different than some of the other workshops we've done because there are several different types of found poetry. It's more of a process than a thing, although it does produce some products that can be really, really fascinating. And the coolest part about it is it often surprises the writer. So sometimes we don't know what we're going to find and where we're going to end up. And that sort of openness to the idea of play can be really stimulating and can help, especially if you're kind of in a rut and you're not sure what to write about. So the best definition that I can come up with here is that found poetry is poetry that's inspired or influenced by found artifacts or artifacts that you come across in the wild, so to speak. It can come from different sources and or a combination of sources. So sometimes people think about poets as writers who just will like pull down inspiration from the ethereal muses and it has to all just come out of their head, you know, miraculously. And that's great if and when that happens, but that is not the only way to create poetry. Found poetry means you're going to go out and you're going to collect pieces of things that serve as stimuli or touchstones to launch you off into an area of inspiration. This style often relies on the revision process as a creative tool. So not just as an editing tool, but as part of the creative process itself to rework and rearrange elements and ideas into a draft. So we're intentionally inserting or incorporating new things to sort of shake it up and to make it new and interesting and see how it changes the dynamic of the things that we already have going on in that draft. Found poetry often incorporates abstract items into poems. So this could be those abstractions that we talked about, so themes and ideals, but it can also just be abstract in the term or in the sense that these two things might not normally exist next to each other in real life or in poetry, but we're going to play with them and it's going to maybe result in something that would be the equivalent of like an abstract painting that still has its own very unique, maybe random, maybe even chaotic sense of beauty if that's where it leads us. But it can also produce some very ordered and specific concrete poetry if that's the direction that you choose to take it in. So it really is wide open. Found poetry challenges us to meld different genres, different mediums, and even different literary concepts together to create something unexpected even to us. As I said, this is one of the strengths of this poetic form, that even to those of us who have been writing for many years, we can always expect to get the unexpected out of found poetry. By starting with an abstract theme in mind, which is something we'll do later today, and adding multiple extra elements, we can see how our creative writing can evolve under the slightest changes. So I think about it almost like an experiment. Like you're going to add one element in at a time, or you can at least, and we're going to do that today. So you kind of get to see the impact that each addition has on the piece. And if for whatever reason you don't like one of them, you can always go back to your earlier draft. And that's one of the reasons that I suggested keeping a separate file or a separate section on your page. Like instead of erasing and rewriting, just move on to the next page and rewrite it so that you can always go back to that earlier draft if you like it better. Don't be afraid to experiment and change your poems drastically as we go through this process. That's the point. I will say that oftentimes when I'm playing with found poetry, the original provocation, the thing that sparked the poem, might eventually get written out of the poem. Like it might eventually get cut or dropped because I don't need it anymore because it took me to a new place or it did its job of getting me thinking about things and it's not required in the final piece. And that's totally fine. Don't feel like you have to keep the mention of the thing. In your final poem, whatever is going to work the best for you is going to be the best way to do this. So when we talk about gathering artifacts, this isn't necessarily the same as archaeological artifacts, but it's used in a similar sense because we're sort of excavating the things around us. So an artifact can be anything that can be used as a writing prompt. So it could be a phrase that's pulled from a random page on a book or a magazine or a newspaper or a periodical or any sort of text. It could even be a piece of text from a package. So, your pretzel bag or a shoebox or whatever oftentimes has text on it. And if you take those words completely out of context and spin them up with other abstractions and other snippets of text, sometimes you can get some really interesting ideas and takes on the things that surround our everyday lives. It could actually be an object itself, like we did in the quick write, or a sound, a color, a song lyric, a setting, a feeling, really anything that gives you inspiration that you have found and collected or picked up to use in your piece. Now with that, we need to make a quick note on plagiarism and the use of other people's work. So as most of you are probably aware, plagiarism is the act of stealing pieces of someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as your own without due credit being given. That is not what found poetry is meant to be. So what we don't want to do is just copy entire lines out of a published work, put them in our piece, and pretend that it's ours. On on the contrary, when we gather artifacts for found poetry, we're looking for general words or ideas to use as inspiration to create something of our own. If you wish to include a piece of text from a published work that is not in public domain in a finished draft, you should quote it and cite it properly. Now, if it's in the public domain, you're free to, modify it however you want to. But just a note on the differences there of stylistic inspiration versus plagiarism. Okay, here is an example of a found poem that I wrote during one of my morning writing group sessions. And it was inspired by a poem called Never Ending Birds by David Baker. And this is a beautiful poem that describes a family looking at the clouds, and then they realize some of the clouds are actually clouds or flocks of birds. And there's so many of them that they're just never ending, and they're moving through the sky in a really beautiful and surreal way. And they're pointing at them through the car window. So those two quotes that I have there down at the bottom of the screen were the little snippets that sort of prompted the idea for this poem. So the idea of looking at something through a car window and the idea that something was never ending prompted me to write this poem called Warp. And I'll read it, and then you can kind of see where the found elements tie themselves in here. In sci-fi shows, stars fly by ships like iridescent snowflakes, tiny pixels lit up skiing sideways through galactic ink. It's sharp to watch for short takes, scene breaks, but what weight of motion in a day, a year of streaking wild, a generation's windshield pointed at abyss mesmerized in confettied one-point perspective. Midwest winter drivers know this trance, the snow hypnosis wonder stretching time to warp speed in the window glass of a Grand Am, every flake a widening world unto itself. So you can probably see the never-ending aspect here is snowflakes and or the idea of stars. So I'm using the snow as a metaphor to talk about the stars or vice versa. And I'm using both, the idea of a windshield in a car and in a spaceship. So the word never ending does not show up in here, neither does birds. But it was enough of a provocation that this cool idea that's, been kicking around in my mind when I watch sci-fi shows was able to spark this poem into existence. So a found idea that produced a work. Okay, quick check. I want you to look back at your quick write poem from earlier and try to add the idea of something that is never ending into the poem. So we're going to insert another element here. And then I want you to see how does that change the meaning of your poem and what new ideas surface. So you can either kind of brainstorm and actually rewrite the draft, which I'd encourage you to do here. Or if that feels a little overwhelming, just sort of think about how that idea might be incorporated into your poem and how it would change if you were to do that. So you can go either direction. You can do creative or you can do some metacognition here. But I'll give you a couple minutes to do that and see what emerges. All right, we've reached the part of the workshop where you're going to get to practice these techniques by using elements around you. So we're going to write for several different sessions here, and I'll give you different prompts to pull, but you're going to be using the things that are around you. So no matter where you are, what setting you're in, you'll be able to just use what's available. Sometimes we'll pull texts, sometimes objects, etc. And then I'll kind of give you time to write. So if at any point you don't like one of the options that's there, feel free to substitute. The beautiful thing about found poetry is you literally can use anything as a prompt. So feel free to get creative and make your own substitutions if you want. If you want to leave your device and go somewhere else and find a better environment for stimuli, go for it. There'll be a little counter up on the screen so that you can tell when it's time to come back and rejoin us. So enjoy this. This is meant to be fun and creative and just sort of an open opportunity to experiment with language. So I hope you enjoy. All right, we're at writing time, and I just want to make a note here that our writing time today is going to last a little bit longer than in our previous workshops because it's a multi-step process, and some of our mentor texts are actually embedded within our writing time here. So you'll get to both analyze them and then apply some of the techniques directly from them. So the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to add an element of chance to your prompt selection here. So go ahead and choose a number between 1 and 20. Okay, if you have your number, then I'm going to move it to the next slide, and that's going to give you your abstract concept that we're going to work with today for our writing prompt. So find your number below. So let's say I chose 11, then my abstract concept would be ambition that I'm going to work with. Now, if you really don't like the one that you landed on with your number, feel free to pick a different one on the screen or just come up with your own if there's one that you really are wanting to work with that's not on the list. You can go ahead and do that, but write it down on your piece of paper. And then I want you to take a couple minutes here and do one of the following. Either jot notes or mind map on the following. Now, a mind map is where you stick the word in the center of the page, put it like in a circle in the middle, and then you branch off any ideas that come to you. Some people like to make it like a little wheel or little pods branching off from each other, but the idea is to get as many ideas onto the paper as possible and look for connections. So the questions that are going to drive that analysis are, what does this concept mean to you? Do you have a definition that you think of when you imagine this word or this abstract concept? What people or events or connections come to mind when you think about it? So if I had ambition, I'm going to have a mention of my careers on there. I might have my running goals on there, you know, etc. And I might put politicians on there. You can make as many different connections as you want, but this is going to give us some raw material on which to draw when you end up drafting. So I'm going to give you a few minutes here to make associations and rack your brain what comes to mind. It also could be specific memories. So if you have specific vivid memories that you might be interested in working with a little bit today, you could also write those down. So a little bit of writing time here, and then we will go to the next step. Okay, now that you have some thoughts down about your abstract concept, now it's time to gather some artifacts. So I want you to grab two books or texts that are from two different mediums or genres. So I might choose a sci-fi novel and a book of poetry, or you could choose a magazine and a newspaper. Try to find things that are fundamentally different in form. You could also pull up your favorite blog or news website and find two articles on there if you're not somewhere where there are physical books to be had. I'll give you a minute to grab texts and then come back. So we're just going to find them here and then I'll give you instructions on what to do with them. Okay, now the fun part. So for each of your two texts, you're going to open to a random page or spot on the text, place your finger somewhere on the page and see what is there underneath your finger. Record a short phrase, no more than one sentence, in your notebook. Now, if you happen to land on something that is specific to a character like Harry Potter smiled, feel free to do it over again and get something that's a little more abstract or open to interpretation. You can also just redo it if you really don't like what you got. We have time here for you to collect some good samples. So, as an example, here are two artifacts I found from two books I grabbed off my shelf. So from the Illustrated Man, I have Chanted in the Midnight Harbors, which I find evocative and ethereal and all kinds of interesting. And then from The Open Boat by Stephen Crane, I found The Stern Impression of a Scene in the Grays of Dawn. So those two images happen to, I think, meld really in a really fascinating way. Sometimes you might get things that are like very contrasting, very hard, and sometimes they might seem to meld together. That's all part of the fun and the randomness of doing this. So I'll give you a couple minutes here to find those, record them in your book, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, time for step 3. We're going to choose a location or setting for your poem. So it might be something that emerged in your theme mind map when you were playing with your abstract concept, or it could just be a place of interest, real or imaginary. So for the example artifacts I found on the previous slide, I would probably set my poem somewhere near water, maybe in the harbor that's being described there, but I wouldn't necessarily have to do that. You can go any direction that you want with it. So I'm going to give you another 2 minutes to choose a setting and then take a moment to describe what the setting looks like, any relevant details. Getting some sensory detail down here might be a good idea, but just kind of try to have a picture of a place in your mind. Now it's time to write a poem. You can incorporate your theme and your artifacts any way that you choose. Aim for around 15 lines, but any length or style is fine, and we'll be coming back to this draft for one more round of revision after this. So we're going to write for about 10 minutes and see what you can come up with. You have about 1 minute of writing time remaining. All right, hopefully you were able to get a draft of something interesting. Now let's add some additional elements by looking at some example poems together to glean some mix-ins. These poems relate encounters with something interesting, an object, a person, a setting, an idea, and could be seen as fitting within the found poetry tradition in that respect. Although I will say it's sometimes hard to tell whether a finished published poem started out with some sort of found element, but these poems definitely encapsulate that spirit, and then we're going to use them as a place for maybe some additional inspiration. So the first one that I want to look at here is called Dreaming in Swedish by Philip Levine, and it's on 2 slides here. So I'll read it all the way through, and then we'll talk about what elements are going on here that might give us an additional thing to play with in our poetry. The snow is falling on the tall, pale reeds near the seashore, and even though in places the sky is heavy and dark, a pale sun peeps through, casting its yellow light across the face of the waves coming in. Someone has left a bicycle leaning against the trunk of a sapling and gone into the woods. The tracks of a man disappear among the heavy pines and oaks, a large-footed, slow man dragging his right foot at an odd angle as he makes for the one white cottage that sends its plume of smoke skyward. He must be the mailman. A canvas bag, half closed, sits upright in a wooden box over the front wheel. The discrete crystals of snow seep in one at a time, blurring the address of a single letter, the one I wrote in California and mailed, though I knew it would never arrive on time. What does this seashore near Malmo have to do with us, and the white cottage sealed up against the wind, and the snow coming down all day without purpose or need? There is our canvas sack of answers, if only we could fit the letters to each other. Okay, so here Levine paints us a picture of a cottage, a bike, a mailman, a letter, and the story that might be weaving all of them together. So this poem relies heavily on specific sensory detail. So let's go back here and look at, we have a canvas bag, half closed, sits upright in a wooden box over the front wheel. That's a very specific visual detail. And then if we go back one more, we have the sky is heavy and dark, a pale sun peeps through, again some visual. And then I think I would argue that down below, a large-footed slow man dragging his right foot is almost kind of a tactile feel, because we can kind of feel what that is like to drag your foot through dirt. So we have several things going on here. We even have a little bit of personification happening across the face of the waves. Then we also have the fact that this poem is setting a scene very intentionally. It's creating almost a still life painting in our minds of a specific image. There are these objects that have been left in a place of significance. They've been left out because they're in use, and their position there implies something about the characters and the setting here. So it's eliciting emotion through a collection of objects whose position and description imply something about human life. So we have very much a poem of description happening here, and this is one technique that you might be able to pull into your poem here. We're going to go over three different examples and 3 different techniques here, but strong sensory detail and scene setting to the point of almost like a tableau can be a really powerful image to incorporate into a work. So there's the first one that we can play with here, and I'll give you a list of these again at the end. But feel free to make any notes as we go here. The second poem I'd like to share with you is called Snow by David Berman. And I'm going to read it and see if you can pick up on the elements or stylistic choices that this poet is using that make this piece really strong, that we might be able to borrow and make our own. Walking through a field with my little brother Seth, I pointed to a place where kids had made angels in the snow. For some reason, I told him that a troop of angels had been shot and dissolved when they hit the ground. He asked who had shot them, and I said a farmer. Then we were on the roof of the lake. The ice looked like a photograph of water. Why? He asked. Why did he shoot them? I didn't know where I was going with this. They were on his property, I said. When it's snowing, the outdoors seems like a room. Today I traded hellos with my neighbor. Our voices hung close in the new acoustics. A room with the walls blasted to shreds and falling. We returned to our shoveling, working side by side in silence. But why were they on his property? He asked. Okay, so think about what you see here that this author is doing that makes this poem powerful, that we could maybe play with. There are a whole lot of things going on. The ones I want to point out to you here are the fact that this is essentially a poem structured around a conversation with another person. So in this case, it's the author's brother, and they're talking about snow angels. The poem displays several elements that make it engaging. One of them is a narrative. So we talked about this in our second poetry workshop, the fact that we have somewhat of a story plot here of these 2 people walking outside, they come upon snow angels, and then the narrator invents a story of their origin that sort of backfires, right? And the younger brother then has a ton of questions that maybe make the narrator rethink what they said. And there's also the interaction with the neighbor. So we have a set amount of time, we have people moving through a space, and we have a conflict. The fact that the narrator kind of lied and then has to deal with the consequences of telling a young child something that is not completely true that has ramifications. So it's definitely a narrative. We get a little bit of characterization. There are 3 distinct characters. There's the narrator, the brother, and the neighbor. Seth is definitely characterized, that's the brother, as being curious and asking why constantly. And we get a little bit of characterization from the narrator also. So we have distinct people who are interacting in this world. And then the technique I really want to draw your attention to here is that we have actual lines of dialogue included as lines in the poem. So I'm going to back up and show you here. This last line of the poem, but why were they on his property, he asked. That's written just like dialogue would be in prose, except it doesn't have the quotation marks on it. And the dialogue is really an integral part of this poem's meaning because it's centered around a conversation. And sometimes a few lines of well-placed dialogue can add a lot of dimension to a piece because it implies interactivity. You have people, you have more than one voice that is bouncing around inside of the work, and that can be really powerful. You might also have noticed here that there are some really strong pieces of imagery, of figurative language. I think my favorite line is, "Then we were on the roof of the lake." So that's a beautiful metaphor, obviously describing the ice of a frozen over lake as a roof. And then we have a simile, like a photograph, of water. So tons of other techniques going on here, and you're more than welcome to draw on those from this poem if the ones I pointed out aren't really jiving with the direction that you want to take it. But here's another set of stylistic choices that you could potentially draw on. Again, I'll put these back up in a list for you at the end, but let's look at our last piece. Now, this is an excerpt from a poem called Kicking a Stone by Robert Vivian. This is from a collection called Mystery My Country. It's one of my favorite books, and he actually calls these dervish essays after the Turkish dance that involves spinning and spinning around a floor. And this is actually only an excerpt. This is only about the first half of the poem that I'm going to share with you. But I want you to pay attention not just to what he's talking about, but how the structure of the poem impacts the meaning that you're getting across here. And then we'll put some names to those techniques. So, kicking a stone. How the whole world is in it, and a life, and so much love, and playful seriousness, for stone must be question and answer of foot, must be point of contact between flesh and earth, and for thousands of years people have been kicking stones. And will it stay on the road, the trail, the sidewalk? Will it traverse the high wire of all my pent-up hopes and dreams? And in this innocent act, how the whole race is redeemed and made young again, whatever the age of the kicker, who is half a shin away from outright dancing. And let's see how long we can kick the stone. Kick the stone without losing it, for the stone has many hard edges and angles and is not perfectly round, but almost cruciform, trapezoidal, and even jagged, and how the stars are in the stone, and moon and river, and how wind is in the stone, and the dry kiss of hay falling into the loft. And kicking a stone, I felt my heart rising up into my throat, on the brink of floating into the sky, and how watching the stone roll and stumble over the trail, I felt at home again in this human body. Okay, I'm going to give you a second to process that and see what you notice that this author is doing that lends power to this excerpt. So I kind of gave you a hint when I described the dervish essay, but we definitely have this idea of circling an abstraction. So there's a concrete object here, right? There is a stone. This whole piece is about the act of kicking a stone on a path. However, it's not really just about the stone, right? There's a ton of abstractions. Even just looking at this slide here, we have the words earth, we have hopes, dreams, innocent, redeemed, age. So many abstract things are happening here. And then we have this idea of connection, of stone meeting human foot, and there being some kind of an exchange of significance there. And then this poem is also a great example of lyricism. There is a snippet of narrative also. So we do have a character who's doing a thing, right? He kicks a stone down the path, and actually later on in the poem, it tells the outcome of where the stone ended up. So we do also have a narrative, but I would argue that the lyricism in this piece, the specific language and the word choice and the cadence and the rhythm of it are the overwhelming, powerful feature that we have going on here. And then I also want to point out, as I mentioned earlier, this is a stream of consciousness style, similar to the quick write that I did. And that involves a series of images that happen very rapid fire, kind of in a flow. And in this case, they are circling that abstraction of how long do things last and how do I connect with the natural world, and how do those interactions affect my emotions and the way that I feel, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all very universal things that it's circling. So any of these things here, abstraction, lyricism, or stream of consciousness, any of those might be a technique that you maybe want to play with here in your revision turn, which we are now at. So now I want you to go back to your poem draft and revise it, write a new draft, okay? Don't erase it or like scribble it out, but start a new draft. I'll give you plenty of time here. And incorporate one or more of the poetic elements that we just discussed. So earlier on our quick check, I asked you to incorporate an idea, the idea of something never ending. Now I'm asking you to incorporate a stylistic technique. So you can choose one or all of these. Sensory details, setting a scene or creating a still life painting. That was from the first poem that we looked at. And then a narrative thread that tells a story and or lines of dialogue. A section of lyric or stream of consciousness writing that cascades from one image to the next. So these were lifted from those 3 poetry examples that we just looked at, and you're welcome to use any of them that sound like it might add an interesting angle to the piece that you have as a working draft. So again, start a new draft. Feel free to change it as much as you want. Keep the parts that feel like they're working and let go what isn't. So a really good strategy that I have learned from many, many amazing writing teachers is grab a highlighter or a pen and go through and mark the spots that are working right now, and then lift those into a new document and play with those plus these new elements. So feel free to leave behind what isn't working, okay? So we're going to write for another extended block of time. This will be our final working with this piece, although obviously you're free to do more with it after the workshop. So have fun synthesizing here and see what you can come up with. You have about 1 minute of writing time remaining. Now go ahead and look back at your poems. In what way did you build from the provocation of your chosen artifacts? Did any of them appear literally in your final draft, well, your last draft that you did, or did the ideas evolve into something completely different? And then I always love asking this question, what parts of the poem that you wrote do you love? Second question is, look around you right now. What else is present that could potentially be used as an artifact to spark a poem? Sometimes we don't notice the things around us every day or think about them in poetic terms, but sometimes there's a really rich environment there to be tapped. What interactions have you had recently with people, institutions, nature, or technology that might translate well to a found poem? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about these questions and jot down your answers. If you're in a setting where you can discuss these with other people, that's always a good thing, or just record the answers for your own benefit. Our takeaways for today's session on found poetry are: poetry prompts are literally everywhere. Anything can be used to spark a poem, and if you need some inspiration, hopefully this process will come to mind so that you will always have some material to work with and from. It's okay to rummage around in texts for phrases and ideas to play with. If something in everyday life strikes you as interesting, make a mental note of it and see if it might work itself into a poem. This is especially true, I find, of unique conversations that happen or events that just strike me as interesting that I want to remember. Keep adding unique elements to the mix until you get something that you like. As always, adapt these techniques to apply to your unique writing goals. Thank you for joining us for this workshop on crafting poetry. Be sure to view the other workshops in this series, which you'll see on the screen in a moment during the credits. The Community Writing Center offers a number of other writing workshops, along with free consultations on any piece of writing. To learn more, please visit our website at communitywritingcenter.com. Thank you.